Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We are nearing the end of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier. Today we'll be taking a look at round number 6 of 7. Lasker's current 4 out of 4 lead puts him very cleanly in first place, but he has not mathematically won the tournament yet, and that is something that especially his current opponent will be looking to take full advantage of, Emil von Feyerfeil. Now, Feyerfeil is a veteran of the Vienna Chess Society, having taken part in and found great success in their tournaments throughout the past 2 decades. Here, for example, are the results of the 1868 edition, where we can see he came in second place out of somewhere in the ballpark of 50 participants. This wasn't documented as well as I'd like, but certainly a large tournament nonetheless. And here, his magnum opus, the 1871 edition, where he finished clear first, and we can see there 68 total points. So again, very large tournament. Not entirely sure the quality of the opponents, but at that large of a field, it really doesn't matter too much. In terms of more close competitions, here are the results from the 1875 Vienna Chess Championships, where he came in shared second. If the cross table looks a little bit weird, it's because they played 3-game matches against each other and then recorded the result of the match overall. It's definitely a strange looking format. If you want to read into it more, I would suggest taking a look at the International Tournament at Vienna 1873. They use the same format there, and there exist plenty of sources to explain how it works in those. But that last result was 14 years ago. Since then, von Feyerfeil has gone into hibernation, and he has only now come out to show the world that experience does indeed triumph youth. Let's see if that's true today against our subject. Von Feyerfeil, with the white pieces, opens with e4. e5, and now yet another newcomer to our second move extravaganza, f4, the King's Gambit. It almost makes sense in a way. Losing and drawing mean pretty much the same thing within the context of the tournament, since this is one of those tournaments where really only first place matters, so why not go all out? And of course, this was how we go all out back in the 19th century. Now, Lasker has certainly accepted his fair share of King's Gambits in his day, but because of the importance of this tournament, he decided to play bishop to c5, declining the gambit this way. Later in his career, he would prefer to decline it more often with d5. Okay, we have knight to f3, d6, bishop to c4, knight to c6, knight to c3, knight to f6, d3, all of this fairly regular stuff. And here Lasker decides to play the move bishop to e6. Now, the tournament book calls this an inadvisable deviation from the theory. Bishop to g4 is the prescribed move, which was played recently at the New York 1889 tournament between Mikhail Chigorin and Constant Ferdinand Baril. Chigorin immediately went wrong here with h3, as after the trade on f3, black was able to get a knight to d4, the queen moved to g3 and then castles, and Chigorin would go on to lose this game as white against a relatively unknown player. But bishop to e6 instead played by Lasker, and here von Feyerfeil shows why this is not a solid move, by playing the move bishop to b5. Now here the tournament book recommends castling, which is rarely a move that you can really object to. Here Lasker plays the move a6, which really tells Feyerfeil that he has to trade on c6, which he was going to do anyway. After b captures on c6, white can't just win a pawn here with f captures on e5, this is worth pointing out. D captures e5 and knight captures e5 would run into queen to d4, and now white has to defend against both queen to f2 and taking the knight, and so white just loses a piece here. But the justification that he can use, and this is why bishop to e6 is not a good move, f5, simply gaining space and making this bishop look really dumb. So the bishop drops back to d7, and now bishop to g5 here. Now this position is of course very infrequent, as bishop to e6, again, not a very solid move. There are 2 games in the database where black played queen to b8, which makes sense, you get on the open file and you get out of the pin. But here Lasker again decides to push a flank pawn, and h6 is a novelty. So it's as of move 10 that the players are playing a unique game. And interestingly, for the first time, this is Lasker playing the novelty. The bishop drops back to h4. g5 is certainly a move here. It's one of the engine's top recommendations, but then you never get a chance to fight against the f-pawn. Lasker decides to play rook to b8. Makes sense, put the rook on the open file. Rook to b1, and now queen to e7. Queen to e2 from Feyerfeil, and now Lasker really demonstrates that he doesn't like his position by playing the move d5. Now let's take a second to really take everything in. His position, not very strong. His light squared bishop is very awkward, his knight is pinned, and he's getting squeezed by this lack of space. And so this d5 move attempts to break that up at the cost of a pawn. Now this position, really interesting. I do think it's worth taking some time to go through it. After e captures on d5 and bishop captures on f5, the tournament book gives 3 different lines corresponding to the 3 different ways that you can take a pawn here as white. D captures on c6 is probably the one that I like the least. Here black castles, and now the move given is knight to d5. The queen goes to d6, and now white does get to mess up the pawn structure. Knight captures f6, g captures f6. And now the move they give is knight to d2, which makes sense. You want to get rid of any e4 ideas. But now queen to d4 from black. And they end with, it is questionable which of the two will achieve their goal more quickly in this interesting position. And indeed, this is absolutely wild. White will get the chance to take here on f6 if they want to go up 2 pawns, but black is going to be bringing their rooks to the center. e4 will come eventually, and the white king will be blown apart here. It's extremely complicated and pretty much exactly what Lasker is looking for. Queen captures on e5 is probably the more direct way to take the pawn. Queen e5, knight e5, and now bishop to d4 looks like it wins something here. This knight is technically undefended as the pawn is pinned. This knight is undefended as well. And white does lose a piece, but only temporarily. King to d2, and after bishop captures on e5, the rook h comes to e1, and you're going to win this piece back. Now, the tournament book gives the move knight captures on d5, which is a blunder. Knight to g4 was the only move that was any good for black. Here they say after rook captures on e5 and bishop to e6, they conclude that white is a little bit better, but I'd argue that their league's better, because you have something like knight to e4, let's say black castles, and now knight to c5. These pawns are just blockaded, and white is looking extremely positionally won at this point. Finally, you can capture a pawn through knight captures on e5. And again, bishop to d4, same idea, but here we get knight captures on c6 right away. And now we just get a bunch of liquidation. Bishop captures on c3 with check, king to f2. We trade queens here, queen e2, king e2, and now rook b2. Rook b2, bishop b2, and now rook to b1. You can't move this because rook to b8 will come. Knight captures on d5 and rook captures on b2. And here the tournament book ends by playing the move king to d7. I think I prefer castles just because I don't want to allow any knight checks from white. They don't evaluate this position in the tournament book, but I reckon the black queen side should leave black at a disadvantage in this endgame. So either way, that is a lot to calculate and exactly the kind of complication that Lasker is looking to create. Von Feyerfeil decides to ignore all of that and simply retreat his knight to d1. This keeps his advantage, but prevents him from having to go through all of those crazy lines. Fair enough, can't argue with that. D captures on e4. Castles, again, was recommended by the tournament book, and I can't argue with that in any capacity. D captures on e4, and now queen to d6 from Lasker, so he's finally unpinned his knight. Knight to d2, again guarding against any potential e4 pushes should this pawn come under fire, and indeed it does come under fire. Queen to d4. Now, unfortunately, in this position, this is really a nothing burger move. We saw this in a previous position where there wasn't a knight on d1. The problem with it here is that now white just plays bishop to f2. Now, if the knight wasn't on d1, this move wouldn't really do much. Black would simply trade everything here on f2 and play a reasonably equal endgame. But as it stands, this just kicks the queen back. It's been speculated that Lasker was hoping to see knight to b3, at which point if he sacrifices the exchange here on b3, a b3, and knight e4, this gets to be really complicated again, and black would actually be reasonably fine in this position. But as stated, bishop to f2 simply kicks the queen back, and both players continue by castling. Now, this has been Lasker's worst game so far. I don't think that's a controversial statement to make in any capacity. Aside from his attempted pawn sacrifice on d5, it really feels like he's been playing poorly with this useless queen maneuvering, his bishop not really finding a good home, and his problems are not over yet, unfortunately. Here comes knight to b3. The bishop pair is really Lasker's only asset, so it makes sense that he tries to preserve it with bishop to b6, but now c4. Von Feyerfeil really forces Lasker to make a decision, and it's really difficult for him to make a comfortable one. Now here, the decision Lasker decided to go with is to play the move c5. Now, of course, this prevents white from playing c5 with the fork, but it locks in this bishop. Lasker was doubtlessly counting on his bishop pair to provide him with some sort of compensation for his lack of space and wrecked pawn structure, but either here or on the last move, he really had to accept reality and just trade it off. Bishop f2, knight f2, and here c5 actually looks like a good move, opening up an avenue for the remaining bishop to participate in the game. But c5 blocks off his bishop, and if you're going to be trying to argue that the bishop pair is some sort of compensation, this is not the bishop you want to be using for that argument. So, knight to c3 from Feyerfeil. We have rook b to e8, and now the rook b comes to d1, hitting the queen. The queen moves to c6, and now a nice little rook lift, rook to d3. Now, Lasker recognizes what's coming. This rook is going to slide over to the king's side, so he plays the move knight to h7, preparing to solidify. After rook to g3, he plays the move f6, preventing any f6 from white. Unfortunately here, the problems are still not over. Bishop to e3 attacks the technically undefended h6 pawn. King to h8, unpinning his pawn. And now knight to d5. Even if this attack doesn't succeed, von Feyerfeil is just winning positionally as well. This really demonstrates the weakness of the c5 move, and it honestly is the one mistake that Lasker has made this game. Rook to f7 now, and here knight to d2. He's got to get other pieces into the attack. Now here Lasker, I believe, tries to sacrifice another pawn out of desperation with the move knight to g5. The tournament book offers slightly stronger resistance with the line bishop to c8, queen to h5, and now queen to d7 defending the rook. This would certainly be a reasonable defense, but black is just getting destroyed anyways. Knight to g5, here we get to see Lasker's attempt. After queen to h5, the knight is overloaded as this pawn again is pinned. If you try to unpin it, then h4 comes, you kick the knight back, and again this pawn is pinned, so you're going to take here on h6, and black is just busted. So Lasker plays rook e to f8, he sacrifices the pawn, and why not? Bishop captures on g5, f captures g5, and rook captures on g5. Again, this pawn is pinned. Here Lasker tries bishop to e8, so he lines up a little discovery. Queen to h4 gets rid of this, and again Lasker is in very dire straits even after that sacrifice. Here white is threatening to play rook to g6, so either now or on the next move, black will probably have to retreat this queen back to d7, but at some point f6 is going to come, the black king side gets torn apart, and this is just game over. So again, Lasker sacrifices with rook to f6. He's going to get essentially no compensation for this, but he doesn't have much of a choice. Knight captures f6, and now rook captures on f6. And here, von Feyerfeil plays a very satisfying prophylactic move, b3. It's always a good feeling when you can take a timeout and play a slow, consolidating move like this without any actual concern. And indeed, we see it takes a while for Lasker to come up with anything interesting. Queen to d7, and now knight to f3, getting out of the way of the attack. And here the queen drops down to d3. Now he sort of has plans of playing bishop to c6 and going after the e-pawn. It's not a super dangerous threat, but it does give Lasker something to attack. So Feyerfeil decides to defend it. We have rook back to g4. And finally, this bishop gets somewhat into the game with bishop to a5. Now it's hard to see any really active places for it to go, as the knight does control the d2 square, and if the bishop goes to c3 and d4, the knight controls that as well. So it's really hard to see where this is going to actually go, but again, Lasker's working with what he has here. The problem for him is that it's really not enough no matter what he does, because the queen comes to g3, and now I just think it's over. White's got threats against e5 and g7, and Lasker has nothing in return. Here he tries bishop to c3, there's no point in trying to defend this pawn anymore. So rook captures on g7, and now bishop to f7. Here the rook drops back down to g4, and now rook to d6 from Lasker. He at least gets himself onto the open file. Queen to h4 goes after the last pawn standing on the black king side. This is defended through bishop to d2, and now we trade. Knight captures on d2 and queen captures on d2, so the pawn is still defended, but queen to e7. The bishop is attacked, the c-pawn is attacked. We're threatening checkmates through queen to f8. It's just, there's nothing left for Lasker to do other than decide how he wants to lose. And he indeed here, rather than drawing it out and allowing mate in 6 or 7 or whatever it ends up being, here he decides to simply play bishop captures on c4, falling on his own sword, and allowing Emil von Feyerfeil to end the game with queen to g7, checkmate. So yeah, definitely not the way you would expect the first checkmate of the series to go, being against Lasker. But when you take a look at this position here, after c5, Lasker was just down a piece. This bishop was sitting on the queen side doing absolutely nothing, and so it was more than justifiable for Feyerfeil to develop his pieces in an aggressive kingside manner, like so. And of course, if Lasker is down a piece, then he has no way to defend this attack. It was just a foregone conclusion, more or less. So yeah, with that, the final round of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier is going to be very intense, as Lasker will not have a very large lead at all, and we will see the dramatic conclusion to this tournament in the following video. I look forward to seeing you there, and I hope you'll be there to see me. Until then.